You gotta be alive to have the scoop for a lifetime. We never should have come. Let's go.
You can't just leave him.
Run.
The director of the action classic Taken, Pierre Morel, brings us Freelance, and this one stars John Cena, Alison Brie, Christian Slater, and Alice Eve. And this was actually a movie that kind of came out on cinema with really no advertising, but it's kind of like one of these kind of like mid-budget movies that you kind of used to get. It very much reminds me of the kind of a similar movie, Romancing the Stone, which starred Michael Douglas some years ago, which was itself kind of inspired by the Indiana Jones movies. But this one, it really does feel like Romancing the Stone. So it's in some ways a surprisingly smart film, and it has a odd anti kind of capitalism message, which I wonder why, if this is maybe why it's got somewhat buried. Conspiracy hat. Anyway, what is the story? So John Cena plays a guy who used to be in the military, but he's given that up to kind of spend more quality time with his family, and has become a solicitor, a lawyer. But he's not really happy doing that, and he's contacted by his friend who now runs a kind of a private military mercenary group, Christian Slater's character, and he basically tasks him to effectively be a bodyguard for this reporter who's got this interview with this kind of dictator of this kind of government, who is very kind of like, keeps himself to himself and things like this. So he agrees, and the reporter's played by Alison Brie, and they go to this kind of like luxurious kind of lush kind of South American, I think, made up kind of country. And there's a coup that happens, and they are kind of thrust into having to defend themselves and keep this kind of dictator safe at the same time, who may or may not have parallel kind of storylines and kind of interests that may or may not coincide. Along the way, there's shenanigans, there's emotional moments, there's action sequences, and comedy. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. To me, the most interesting thing about this film, as I say, was this kind of anti-capitalism message, which, I haven't watched loads of coverage about this movie, but it hasn't really been brought up. And I don't want to spoil what that is, because it's kind of a plot point that's kind of later on in the film. But it was interesting, and it's certainly interesting seeing this coming from an American film. But it draws parallels to modern society, the way corporations work, the way governments kind of might have military action against certain other kind of like countries and things like that. I don't want to kind of spell it out for you, but I thought that's surprisingly topical for a kind of like an action comedy movie. Now, this is kind of offset by lots of kind of silly, cheesy moments in the movie, but I have to say, I actually quite liked some interesting kind of like ideas that this kind of movie kind of put forward and suggested. And, you could argue it's doing a certain amount of moralising and messaging, and maybe a little one-sided, but they actually do address that in the movie. They actually say this is obviously one side of things. So I actually thought this movie is surprisingly smart in a kind of a dumb action comedy movie packaging. There you go. I wasn't expecting that. Now, as I say, I hadn't read a huge amount about this film, but it was a pleasant surprise to actually have some thought behind this movie. There you go. But is there anything else other than that? Yes, like I said, I do think this movie reminds me so much of Romancing the Stone. We have this kind of mismatched couple who are at odds with one another, you know, in a kind of a hostile environment with a kind of a another kind of character who is somewhat of an antagonistic kind of force, you know, fighting kind of bad guys, mercenaries, locals, all sorts of stuff, in this kind of like jungle environment. And there's a little bit of kind of romantic sort of tension in there as well. There's some kind of fun action sequences. And although this is definitely an action comedy, it's not taken, like the tone is relatively light. And there are some funnier moments, although, you know, it's never like a parody. It's just kind of an action movie, first and foremost, with some comedic kind of moments in there and a kind of a tone which is, you know, it's not your Jason Bourne's kind of style kind of action film. And it's not even a Taken style action film. It is a Romancing the Stone kind of style action kind of film. I did like the cast here. I have to say, I thought John Cena is coming across these days as a very likeable actor, and may well take Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's crown as the kind of like wrestler turned actor favourite in the future. I think he's very, very charismatic, and I really enjoyed the guy who played this kind of dictator. A very interesting character. And for all outward experiences, he's got this kind of like, you know, this veneer kind of smile, and he's all got the slick back hair and the kind of like the gold gun and the posh suits. And on the surface of it, he looks very much like your stereotypical dictator. But there was some interesting things that are done with this character, I have to say. I thought there's some decent action sequences. They're never like over the top. I think this movie, you can tell it's a lower budget movie. It's not low budget, but it's not, you know, it's not like a huge blockbuster in regards to its production budget. But there are some kind of fun action kind of sequences and some, you know, witty kind of banter and things like that. But I should say that the real key for me was actually some of the kind of the more serious topics that this movie actually brought up. Again, I think it slightly offsets that with some of the kind of the foolishness, but there you go, it is what it is. So let's talk about what doesn't work. As I said, I mean, this movie has a little bit of a mix of tones. I don't know if the comedy was ever like super funny. I mean, like I said, this is an action movie first and then a comedy second. So the comedy is more just kind of some funnier reactions to things rather than kind of like set piece jokes, which is probably better. But if you're wanting to watch this for a comedy first and foremost, it's not all that funny, if that makes sense. As I've alluded to, the action sequences are somewhat plentiful, but they're never kind of like anything you haven't kind of seen before. It does feel like a little bit of a kind of a generic kind of jungle action movie in some ways. There are some kind of sequences which are quite fun and enjoyable and well put together, but they're never kind of like, wow, that was incredible. There are some kind of sillier moments and there's one particular moment involving a horse which doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and is that it kind of almost jumps the shark at that point, or I should say jumps the horse. But yeah, there's some kind of like moments here where it just kind of goes a little bit too far with the kind of like the believability and the kind of like the you know, your level of kind of belief that you would have in this movie. Alison Brie's character, I felt, had very little to do. I mean, she serves a point in the movie because she's this reporter, and she does kind of one thing towards the end of the movie which kind of helps Cena's character. But for the most part, she's a damsel in distress. So it feels like a very kind of old-fashioned movie in a ways. I mean, so fans of Romancing in the Stone, because that's kind of how movies were made more then, to a degree. So, you know, but she doesn't have a huge amount to do. Her character is quite thin, I have to say. And in actual fact, there's some story elements that are introduced here. She's talking about this friend who knows this kind of dictator, and I was kind of expecting that story to kind of to go somewhere, and it really didn't. So that, you know, there's that. So I think it's a pretty decent movie. I mean, I think it's hamstrung by maybe a little kind of like lack of scope, and maybe, I mean, it's not a low budget movie by any stretch of the imagination, but there's nothing really kind of stand out visually, I would say. But Cena is very watchable, and I've got to say, I think this movie did a good job of introducing some interesting thematic ideas and certainly talking points that you don't normally see in a film like this. As I said, it's kind of anti-capitalism message, which, you know, may put some people off, but I kind of found it an interesting little bit of commentary. So I will say I kind of enjoyed this one. It's not a classic, but I'll give it a 7 out of 10. And then I would have said like a 6 out of 10, but this extra layer that it kind of adds into it, to me, elevates it a little bit. So I'm going to say a 7 here. Have you seen Freelance? What did you think of it? Please do let me know, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.